Flux Core Welder Shootout, Titanium versus Century. First thing I want to look at is the duty cycle. The Century says 80 amps is 30%. The Titanium says 90 amps is 30%. We're going to test it, but we're going to test them both the same. We're going to do that a little later on in the video. Now let's take a look at the insides of these things. So you'll notice that the insides almost look identical, and they are very similar. They're not identical. On the Titanium, you retain the spool by the same nut that also does the tension spring that keeps the spool from unraveling. And then on the Lincoln, a little quarter push down and a little quarter turn, and wow! It comes right off of there, and you don't have to adjust the tension every time, but you do have to pay attention because if you unlock that, the spool just goes wild. All right, and once you get that thing all wound back on there again, I actually do like that drive or that spool holder. They're a little bit better than the Titanium, even though you can make the mistake. You could do that the same with the Titanium. But anyway, the drive rolls on both machines have both 035 and 030 grooves on them. To change them, you just take the three-sided nut just above the wheel there, turn it 90 degrees, flip the wheel over to whatever wire size you're running, and it's as simple as that. So you'll notice on the Titanium there that they have a chart for 030 wire and 035 wire. And then on the Century on the right, they only give you a chart for 035 wire. So that's a little bit of a downfall for the Century. So Century weighs in right about 15.4. It does have a partially used up spool of wire. And then the Titanium has a full spool of wire in it, and it's coming in at 17.6. So maybe you can add a quarter pound or so to the Century. But either way, the Century is a little bit lighter. The whip on the Titanium is a tiny bit longer, as well as the ground lead. The ground clamp on the Titanium is a little bit lower quality than Century, but not too much. And then the power wire on the Century is a little shorter than the Titanium, about a foot shorter. So that's a little bit of a downfall there. All right, and now that we're inside of it, I'm going to point out my favorite part of the Titanium that the Century doesn't have, and that is the cold feed button. So not only does the motor on the Titanium run quite a bit faster than the Century, it also has the cold feed button, so that runs the motor at full speed when you're replacing your wire. So that saves you quite a bit of time while swapping out the wire. So the Century does have the quicker removal of the spool itself, but that's not going to make up for that not having that cold feed button. All right, now let's get into the important stuff. So our first test is going to be on these little eyes that I made. These are 1/8" plate that I cleaned the mill scale off. And that way we can test 035 and 030 for each welder. On one side of the eye, it'll be push. On the other side, it'll be pull. I don't recommend or like doing push, but some guys may like that. That's why I'm going to include that in our testing here, just so you can kind of see how either one runs. So the Titanium comes set up for 030 wire from the factory. So we're going to start it with that wire, and then the the Century welder, that one comes set up for 035, so we're going to run 035 in it, and that's the Lincoln 035 wire. The Titanium's using the Harbor Freight wire, which is what it recommends. Then once we get done with that, we're going to switch them. We'll switch the wire from machine to machine, flip our drive rolls over, and then and we'll run them with the opposite wires. The chart on the Century does not include 030, so we're going to be guessing. The chart on the Vulcan, I keep calling it a Vulcan, the Titanium, gives you a range. So on the range, we're just going to set it right in the middle, and we're going to call that good. We're not going to get into too much detail. So here is the Titanium 030 in a pull. So it should sound like static, very consistent. If it's not consistent, it's either your movements are not smooth enough or the wire is not coming out smooth enough. I do a little dot at the end to try to fill the crater that will be created. And now here's the Titanium in a push. I don't ever push this wire, so it's quite possible there's going to be some user error. Now here's the Century with the 035. This will sound a little crisper. You can see the weld went quite a bit quicker, and then I did a little zap at the end to try to fill in the crater a little bit. It turns out not to be nearly enough. Here it is in a push. The 030 wire tends, and I assume this is the wire, not as much the welder, tends to leave a lot of BBs when you're welding thicker stuff and you have it turned up like this. This side would be the push side, and this side is the pull side. I believe pulling this flux core wire at a very slight pull is a little bit better. So this is the push side, and you can see how the weird flux formation on it. And then this is the pull side. It looks quite a bit better, but we haven't wire wheeled it yet. So let's wire wheel them, and then I'll show you what I got. So on the left is the titanium. On the right is the FC-90. The FC-90's weld is significantly nicer in the pull. Let's flip them around and see what the pushes look like. All right, I'm going to voice over this part. So now we're into the push side. So the push side on the Vulcan actually looks pretty good other than the spatter. The spatter looks awful. The push side on the 035 on the Century, that was concaved. It doesn't look very good either. That could have been adjusted though. If we would have turned up the wire speed on the Century, that would have probably made that weld look decent. And then on the Vulcan, it was actually pretty good. Other than the spatter, the weld itself looked pretty good. So the wire speed was actually fairly accurate for pushing that one. Now on the other side, when we flip them back over, it's actually the opposite. So the Century is running very good at that angle. That's the angle of my drag that I showed you there. But the wire speed seems right. And then on the Vulcan welder, the wire speed actually seems a little too fast, or we needed a little bit more voltage. All right, now just in real time, I didn't speed this video up at all. This is how fast I work. I'm going to swap the wires from side to side, and this is where that titanium welder with its cold feed is really going to pay off because it really does. It does make changing the wire go quite a bit faster. All right, so before we wire wheel it, we got titanium on the left. Looks pretty familiar. It looks just like the Century on the last run with the 035. And then there is the 030 on the Century. Looks familiar. Looks pretty much like the weld from before. So I think we're seeing a pattern here. It's more to do with the wire than it is either other one. So this is the push on the Century and the push on the titanium with the 035. All right, on the left is the titanium 035 and a pull. It looks really good. On the right is the 030 on the Century in a pull. It looks okay. Spatter, it's again not great. It's 030. The push looks terrible on the 030 on the Century, and the push looked okay on the 035 on the titanium. So these are both the pulls. On the left is the titanium, on the right is the Century, and they both look almost identical. So it is concaved at the end. I could have zapped that a couple more times. But for the most part, they both look really good. And I don't know if the lighting is looking better on one or the other. So try to get a couple angles of it without the shadows. They both look really good. Oh, and one thing, because I mentioned this earlier, I should probably point out, I was worried that 030 on the FC-90, it wouldn't have enough wire speed for the 1/8 inch, if spatter wasn't as much of a concern to you. Well, it did have enough wire speed. I didn't even actually have it maxed out, so it's just at 9.5 on there. And if anything, I actually had it up maybe higher than it needed to be. So the wire speed issue wasn't as much of a concern on the FC-90 as I was thinking it was going to be. All right, guys, so I was playing with titanium since it can turn up higher, and it does weld really good. So these I wove that one over top of a root pass, and then this one I did 2 cover passes over a root pass. So they're roughly 5/16 welds or so. They look good. I don't like weaving over, but I know a lot of guys will, just to try to get something done and repaired, and it did it very, very well. I had it set basically at the bottom end on the voltage for the 3/16 setting, and then the wire speed I had at 8.5, and that was plenty hot for what I was doing right there. So this is welds that I put in with the FC-90 earlier down there, stacked them. I did that on the previous video, and then there's 2 stacked welds from it as well. So it also, both the FC-90 and this thing will lay some pretty good welds. On the heavier stuff as well. So the titanium does turn up more. It's a 125 amp welder, and the 90 is obviously a 90 amp welder. So you got a little bit more room on the titanium, a little bit better duty cycle on the titanium, but you're going to start getting into a pretty short duty cycle if you're going to be doing a lot of big welds like that. So now let's put I have a little amp gauge that we can plug in. So I'm running all of our testing, by the way, on a 50-foot extension cord that has a 12 gauge 50-foot extension cord. Now, in between that extension cord and our welder, I'm going to put an amp gauge, and I'm going to set both welders to 1/8 inch, and we're going to see how many amps it takes to weld 1/8 inch. So now we're going to weld. It's actually measuring less than 18 gauge, but it's 18 gauge metal. At least that's what I attempted to buy. All right, so it started up good. The weld is a little bit inconsistent looking as I'm going because it's actually keyholing a little bit, which means it's burning through, but the wire or the weld puddle is actually filling in the void behind my behind the arc as I'm moving along. So it ends up working out pretty good, or at least theoretically it will. All right, well, I'm not going to lie, that actually looks pretty darn good. You don't get nearly the BBs and stuff when you have the welder turned down like that. And now you can see on this side, you can actually see, I was saying it was keyholing. You can actually see the weld a little bit coming through the other side. I'm going to weld this side now. This side's not nearly as hard to do because we have basically reinforcement on that side. But we'll weld it just so we have a nice little piece that we can show off. All right, now I just set up the FC-90 with the Flux Core 030. The only difference this time is I'm actually running a Lincoln 030 because I wanted to see if this was as spattery hot. But before we do that, we need to do the thin sheet metal. And this is how I've been cheating on the reference, since this doesn't give you a reference for 030. If you see on this chart, the voltage is always the same, going from 030 to 035. The only difference is the wire speed is slightly turned up. So that's essentially what we're going to do again on this one. So we just go down to our 18 gauge, which is heat range 5, And then the wire speed, it says 6, but that's where it increases with the 030, and on the titanium it increases a half. So we're just going to increase it a half. So it says 6, so we'll go 6.5, and we're going to see. That's just going to be our cheater method for getting going on it. We don't have a range on this one, so I know we did do on the lower end of the range on the titanium. This doesn't have a lower end of the range, so we may have to adjust this a little bit. It may run a little hot, but we'll see. We're going to try it right now. So I got another couple pieces of sheet metal, so we'll tack those up and we'll get them welded and we'll compare the results. That is way too hot. We're burning through. So I ended up burning through quite a few times, and I ended up having the heat down all the way down to like 2.5 or so, and the wire speed around the same. Which I think in the end, if we actually had Vulcan amp meters on this thing, I think I was running this a little bit lower than we were running the titanium. But it's really tough to say on things that are just variable numbers. I mean, that mean nothing on those dials. All right, so that ended up looking pretty good as well. So that looks pretty nice. This, I believe I welded that quite a bit colder than the little titanium was running. But for some reason I was having a really hard time burning through with this. And that could be a number of things. But that ended up looking really nice. I wasn't burning through at all. So now we'll just weld the other side so we have a little comparison. And we'll see what this side looks like. And here's the other side. So I was oscillating this one a little bit front to back just to try to make it look a little cooler. It ended up looking worse, I think. I think the other side looks a lot better. See the flux build up again on it. All right, and here is some 1/8" plate. I'm welding it with the FC-90 with that Lincoln 030 inner shield wire. I want to compare the amount of spatter we get compared to what we got when we weld it with the Harbor Freight 030 wire. All right, so the 030 Lincoln wire in the FC-90, no spatter. Well, I guess we're gonna have to make another video comparing Harbor Freight wire to Lincoln wire, and maybe grab some Hobart or something as well. All right, enough with that. Let's duty cycle these things. Let's see how long they'll weld at the 1/8" setting with 035 wire continuously. I'm using my little rotating fixture here. Well, that didn't take very long. So you can see the slag that was building up on the tip. That's as far as I got. And thermal. Okay, well, 4 minutes, 4 seconds. That's a far cry from 30% of an hour. Granted, that's supposed to be broken up throughout the hour, so I don't know, 4 minutes, 4 seconds doesn't seem like it's very long, but it is what it is. Let's see what the titanium can do. And it's off and running. It's doing pretty good. It's set at 1/8", just like the Century welder. So the only difference, I am running Harbor Freight wire in this one instead of the Lincoln, because I wanted to see how much spatter it would create. Well, that made it quite a bit farther. 12 minutes, 50 seconds. So we got a little bit of a wind tunnel going in here right now, but you can see how hot that thing is. And that tip is pretty covered in slag, but I mean, that's a continuous, almost 13-minute weld, which is not too shabby. You can see, I guess the thermal alarm's on. It's not very bright, but maybe that's because I was still pulling the trigger. Nope. Oh well. All right, guys, so I just had a realization. I don't think the titanium actually thermaled off. The welding wire was stuck in the spatter on the end. So as soon as I broke that off, the wire popped out, and then I realized it was actually still working. So it probably would have run a little longer, and now it's had a break, so it's not really fair to start it again. But anyway, it made it 13 minutes before the tip clogged up, I guess, on it. And I guess we'll just call it that. It was significantly better than the Century. So either way, I'm going to wire wheel that, and then we'll look at it. All right, guys, so that was a little bit too much like work for me, and I didn't really have fun doing it, but it did make me realize something, and that's that I might have messed up. Okay, so our testing is still good on the welders, but I wasn't comparing apples to apples on wire. Harbor Freight wire, the Vulcan wire, is E71 TGS wire, single pass wire. That was not an appropriate scenario for it. It still was putting amps through the welder and all that fun stuff. That made no difference. That's not where we weren't testing the quality. But for guys that are like, oh, the Harbor Freight wire sucks and the Lincoln wire is so much better, it's like, well, that's like saying 6010 sucks and 7018 is better, because that's essentially what you're doing. The wire they sell at Harbor Freight is Vulcan E71 TGS, kind of like 6010. The wire they sell at Home Depot, or this Lincoln wire, the common Lincoln wire, inner shield wire, E71 T11 multi-pass wire. It's like 7018. And I'm sure my comment section is blowing up right now with people going, yeah, not the same, not the same. Well, it's similar. It's like comparing the two of them. And it is kind of a similar scenario. Like I was using 030 on the sheet metal earlier in this video. The Harbor Freight wire seemed like it welded better. And I also mentioned that it keyholed, where I was blowing through like crazy with the Lincoln wire, and I had to turn the welder way down so I could use it. Fine, either way, but different. 6010 keyholing, 7018. I'm sure guys can keyhole with it, but not very many people will. And I don't think it's recommended by most. So anyway, I wasn't comparing apples to apples. Now, which welder do I like better? Of course, it's the Century, because if you click the link below, I make a commission on it. So there you go. No. What are the perks of the Century? It's lighter. The whip's a little bit higher quality. The ground clamp's a little higher quality. The titanium, it's a little bit heavier. It has a thicker case though. And it has a longer whip, longer ground clamp, a little bit, very negatable. But it does have a foot longer power cord, which may or may not be handy to you. And it has cold feed. It has chart for 030 and 035. I'm going to have to say, if I were to buy a welder today, only one, or one of these little flux core welders, it would be the titanium. Now, here's the thing. I don't make commissions on the titanium, but I can't in my right mind recommend the Century to someone looking to buy their first little flux core welder. The Century costs $50 more. The titanium seems better. Now, if you have experience with either one, comment below. Good, bad, indifferent. And because people are researching this, like not everyone has $150 to burn, an extra $50 to burn. If I were to buy wire, I do like the Lincoln wire, but it may not be better in every scenario. I'm going to do a video on that later where we test them in unideal scenarios, which is where 6010 would be superior over 7018. So rusty, paint, that type of thing. If you want a welder that can MIG weld as well, neither one of those will do that. But next week I'm testing one similar in size, similar in cost to the titanium, but it will also MIG weld, has a little bit higher duty cycle, theoretically, and a higher max amp rating. So that'll be next week. So stay tuned for that. We'll see you then. Can I help you? I pooped.